Canada just dealt Donald Trump one of his most embarrassing geopolitical defeats yet, and almost nobody in the American media is talking about it. That silence itself tells you everything you need to know about how significant this moment really is. Here is what actually happened. The Trump administration was quietly working behind the scenes to fuel a separatist movement inside the Canadian province of Alberta. The goal was straightforward and audacious: collect enough signatures to trigger a referendum, have Alberta vote to break away from Canada, and then absorb it into the United States as part of Trump's so-called 51st state agenda. This was not a fringe conspiracy theory. This was an active geopolitical operation involving American government figures expressing open enthusiasm for Alberta separatism. A reported $500 billion loan proposal floated to entice the province into leaving Confederation, and coordination with Alberta's own Premier Danielle Smith, who allowed the referendum process to move forward in direct defiance of a previous court ruling. The Trump operation was real, it was organized, and it was moving fast. And then it collapsed completely. A King's Bench judge in Canada just struck down the entire referendum, ruling it patently unlawful. But here is the part that makes this story even more powerful. It was not the federal government that stopped it. It was Indigenous groups in Alberta who brought the legal challenge, who stood up in court, and who won. The Siksika First Nation and other Indigenous communities argued that this referendum violated their constitutionally protected treaty rights, and the court agreed. Chief Samuel Crowfoot of the Siksika First Nation made a statement that deserves to be heard far beyond Canada's borders. He said that the treaties Canada signed are not historical documents. They are constitutional agreements. Think about that for a moment. The very communities that have been ignored, exploited, and pushed aside by the settler state and by oil and gas giants for generations, those communities just became the legal shield that protected Canadian sovereignty from a foreign-backed separatist operation. Where are you watching from today? If you believe the world is entering a far more dangerous phase of political and global instability, subscribe now, because the next major escalation could arrive faster than most people expect. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think the American media will ever give this story the coverage it deserves? Keep reading, because this situation is escalating rapidly and there are layers here that most analysts are not connecting. Let's be clear about what this ruling means strategically, because few people realize how serious this has become on multiple levels. Danielle Smith instructed Elections Alberta to ignore a court ruling and proceed with the referendum anyway. That is not a political miscalculation. That is a constitutional crisis in slow motion. And now a second court has stepped in and said unambiguously, you cannot do this. The legal infrastructure of Canada held the line. But here is the uncomfortable truth buried underneath the victory. The separatist lists, the signatures collected during this campaign, are not just sitting in the hands of Alberta political operatives. According to insiders tracking this situation closely, that data is in the hands of the United States government. Let that sink in. A foreign government was actively collecting political intelligence inside a Canadian province as part of a pressure campaign to fracture the country. That is not trade negotiation. That is not diplomatic disagreement. That is interference at a level that, if Russia had done it, would have dominated every front page in the Western world for weeks. Prime Minister Mark Carney understands the severity of the moment, and he is responding with a combination of strategic clarity and a confidence that is frankly striking. He traveled to Alberta in the immediate aftermath of the court ruling and delivered a message of national unity, speaking directly to Albertans, not past them. But what makes Carney a particularly sharp political operator is that he delivered that message while simultaneously and unmistakably mocking the Trump administration's current predicament. With trade negotiations between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, the successor framework to what used to be NAFTA, still unresolved, Carney stood before cameras and said, essentially, we are ready to negotiate. We know what the issues are. We understand the sectors on the table: auto, steel, aluminum, forest products, copper derivatives, and there are enormous opportunities available for both sides. But it takes Americans to focus. And we are sure that once they are finished with their discussions with China, they will focus. That is a surgical remark, because what Carney is referencing is the reality that Trump's high-profile confrontation with China ended not in triumph but in capitulation. The pressure is building behind the scenes in Washington as analysts and trade observers increasingly note that Trump came away from the China negotiations having blinked first, offering significant concessions while framing retreat as victory. Carney knows this. He is signaling to Canadian audiences and to global markets that Canada is the stable, prepared, strategic partner, and the United States under this administration is distracted, unpredictable, and negotiating from a position of weakness it refuses to acknowledge. And Carney is not stopping at diplomatic positioning. He is making a fundamental strategic pivot in how Canada thinks about its own future. He has declared that Canada must become the source of its own affordable, clean, and reliable energy because, and this is the core of his argument, when you master energy, you master your destiny. He is explicitly rejecting the assumption that Canada can afford to remain dependent on the United States for anything critical to its economic survival. This changes the strategic calculation not just for Canada, but for every American industry and community that has built its supply chain, its tourism revenue, or its trade relationships around Canadian participation. This is Canada saying loudly and clearly, we are building a parallel future that does not require American cooperation to succeed. The International Energy Agency itself has said that Canada has a golden opportunity to construct a more sustainable and resilient energy system. Carney is taking that assessment and turning it into national policy, framing Canada's energy independence as a mission, a superpower-level ambition that requires bold investment and practical results rather than political rhetoric. And the economic consequences of the broader Canada-US Rashkar are already showing up in the data in ways that should alarm anyone paying attention. A comprehensive study tracking travel patterns from Trump's so-called Liberation Day in April 2025 through the following year found a staggering 42% drop in Canadian travel to the United States. And critically, that figure only captures part of the picture because Canadian travelers had already been avoiding the United States for months before Liberation Day. The real decline began earlier and runs deeper. Myrtle Beach, one of the most Canadian tourist-dependent resort economies in the American Southeast, has seen a 65% collapse in Canadian business. Analysts are describing this as a fundamental sea change in how Canadians relate to the United States economy. And it is not just leisure travel. Canadians who previously built business relationships in San Francisco's tech sector or in the auto manufacturing corridors of the Midwest are now redirecting those relationships to the Netherlands, to France, to China. Some tourism-dependent regions in the United States are reporting losses as high as 80%. Las Vegas, which had more workers dependent on Canadian tourism than the entire manufacturing sector of Nevada, has been devastated. This is not a temporary disruption. This is a structural realignment happening in real time, driven not by government mandate, but by the organic decisions of millions of ordinary Canadians who decided that their sovereignty was worth more than a cheap vacation. That is the part that is so politically significant. This was not a coordinated government campaign. This was a bottom-up, citizen-driven economic response to what Canadians across the political spectrum perceive as an existential threat. And it is working. The pressure being applied to American businesses, resort towns, and regional economies is real, measurable, and growing. Donald Trump built his political brand on economic nationalism and strength. But the economic data coming out of this Canadian boycott is showing that his approach to Canada has produced concrete, economic pain for American workers and business owners, the exact people he claims to represent. Meanwhile, the separatist forces in Alberta are now fracturing, having failed to achieve their referendum goal. Some of the more extreme elements within the movement are turning on Danielle Smith herself, threatening to destroy her politically for not doing enough to advance their agenda. She has announced an intention to appeal the court ruling, and there is speculation about whether she might attempt to invoke the notwithstanding clause to override the constitutional protections that Indigenous groups successfully asserted. But the political calculus has shifted dramatically. The court has spoken twice. The Indigenous legal argument has been validated at the highest level of the provincial judiciary, and the national political environment in Canada, shaped by Carney's majority government and his message of unity, makes it extraordinarily difficult for Smith to escalate further without paying a severe political price. The broader lesson here is one that applies far beyond Canada. What we are watching is a determined, coordinated attempt by an aggressive foreign power to use economic pressure, political interference, separatist agitation, and media manipulation to fracture a democratic ally, and that attempt being stopped not by a military response, not by economic retaliation alone, but by a combination of legal institutions, Indigenous rights frameworks, citizen economic action, and political leadership that refused to blink. The courts held, the treaties held, the people held the line. And the scorecard right now reads clearly: Canada wins this round, and the Trump operation to absorb Alberta into a 51st state is in legal ruin. But here is the warning that should not be lost in the celebration of this victory. Danielle Smith is not finished. The separatist networks built with American backing do not simply disappear because a court struck down one referendum. The data collected, the money spent, the political infrastructure built, that does not vanish. And the Trump administration, now facing embarrassment on the China negotiations and a legal defeat in Alberta, may feel motivated to escalate pressure rather than absorb the loss. The situation remains volatile. The next move could come quickly, and it could come from an unexpected direction. Canada's gains are real, but they are not permanent. And the fight for Canadian sovereignty in this era is not a single game. It is a long campaign where every yard gained must be defended and every advantage pressed forward. As one prominent Canadian political voice framed it, social change does not work like a single touchdown. You do not release one press release and win. You do not hold one rally and watch the system transform overnight. What you do is maintain control of the ball. You keep your coalition moving forward 10 yards at a time, never surrendering possession, never losing focus on the direction you are moving. That is exactly what Canada has done here. Indigenous communities took control of the legal ball and ran with it. Ordinary Canadians took control of the economic ball and drove tourism and trade losses deep into American territory. Prime Minister Carney took control of the diplomatic and energy narrative and positioned Canada as the stable, sovereign, forward-looking power in this relationship. Every one of those advances matters. Every yard counts, and Canada is moving the ball down the field. The question now is whether the Trump administration recalibrates, whether Danielle Smith escalates, and whether the separatist network finds a new strategy now that the referendum path is blocked. Watch this space closely. The next development in this story could arrive faster than most people expect, and when it does, the stakes for Canadian sovereignty, for the future of the Canada-US relationship, and for every community on both sides of that border will be higher than ever.